fact that under President Biden's proposed budget, that gross debt will rise from $32.7 trillion at the close of this year to $51 trillion by 2033?
I'm sorry, what number did you give me for?
The president's proposed budget will.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Madam Secretary.
Thank you.
Madam Secretary, isn't it a fact that the president's proposed budget for next fiscal year is $500 billion more than this fiscal year?
On the spending side?
Yes. That's what a budget is.
Yeah. It is about $400 billion.
It's about $500 billion more, right?
It's about what?
$500 billion more, right?
About that.
Isn't it a fact that since 2019 until today, I'm not including the extra $500 billion that y'all want to spend, since 2019 through today, U.S. population has increased 1.8%, and the federal government's budget is up 55%. Isn't that a fact?
Well, we had a pandemic.
Isn't that a fact, though? Are my numbers right?
I don't know those numbers.
You don't know? You never looked at that?
I don't have those numbers in my head. I'm not disputing them.
Okay. Isn't it a fact that the president's proposed budget proposes $4.7 trillion in new taxes?
It does propose significant additional taxes, yes.
4.7 trillion?
Something like that, yes.
Okay. You talked about reducing deficit. Isn't it a fact that under President Biden's proposed budget, that gross debt will rise from $32.7 trillion at the close of this year to $51 trillion by 2033?
I'm sorry, what number did you give me for?
The president's proposed budget will increase gross debt from $33 trillion at the close of this year to $51 trillion in 2033. Isn't that correct?
Well, debt held by the public, which is,
No, ma'am, that's gross debt. Isn't that a fact?
that's probably a fact.
So you haven't reduced the deficit, have you?
The deficit, the debt and deficits are reduced by the president's
How can
budget.
you go from $33 trillion to $51
because-
trillion and call that a reduction in the deficit?
Because that's a calculation for which you need a baseline, and then you compare the budget and the deficits and debt in the budget with a baseline in which there are none of the changes, either in revenues or in spending, that are
Here's
proposed
my
in the
baseline.
budget.
Here's my baseline. At the end of this year, we project, people a lot smarter than me, probably not than you, but smarter than me, say that gross debt's $33 trillion. They say if the president's budget is implemented by 2033, it'll be $51 trillion. Isn't that a fact?
If the president's budget is not implemented and none of the changes are made, it will be worse than that. And so the president's budget has improved the fiscal outlook relative to what we would have without the president's proposals.
Even though it raises gross debt from $33 trillion to $51 trillion, you say that's an improvement.
It is an improvement because it raises taxes by more, and it leads to.
That includes taxes. In what world is that an improvement, other than Washington and Long Island?
It's an improvement in that the revenue increases far exceed proposed investments.
Okay. All right, let me ask you this. Isn't it a fact that in January of 2019, the Federal Reserve issued a warning to Silicon Valley Bank over its risk management systems?
I have no idea. I'm not responsible in any way.
But you're in charge of the banking bailouts and the crisis, right?
I am not involved in banking supervision, and I don't have access to any information about the supervision of Silicon Valley Bank.
Okay, so you don't know whether or not the Fed, you haven't looked to see whether or not the Fed issued a warning, 4 years ago to the bank over its risk management systems?
That's not public information, and it's not
Sure it is. It's in the
information.
Wall Street Journal.
Well, it may be in the Wall Street Journal, but it's not public information, and it's not information that I have access to.
Well, I'll give you a copy of this article.
I've read the article, but
The Fed issued a matter requiring attention. And it said your risk management practices are terrible and you need to improve them.
that is what the article says.
Right. Isn't it a fact that months before SVB went under, that the bank disclosed that its mark-to-market value of its bonds was $16 billion less than their balance sheet value?
They did make such a statement.
Did the people at the Federal Reserve just not read it?
I'm not at the Federal Reserve.
I know.
I was at the Federal Reserve.
But you're at the Treasury and you're in charge of the banking crisis. Let me ask you.
I am not in charge of the supervision of the bank.
Let me ask you this. Senator Heinrich talked about the 2018 amendments to the Dodd-Frank Act. Isn't it a fact? Now, SVB was not stress tested in 2022. 34 banks were. Here's the Fed's report. Isn't it a fact that if SVB had been stress tested, it would have passed?
Stress tests look at capital of a bank.
Here's the yes, ma'am. Under the stress test, isn't it a fact that SVB would have passed?
I don't know. It wasn't stress
You need to
tested.
look into that, Madam Secretary.
This is not my job. This is the Federal Reserve's job.
Okay, isn't it a fact that when the Federal Reserve stress tested in 2022, it only stress tested credit risk, it didn't stress test duration risk? Isn't that a fact?
I believe the stress tests in general partially address and take account of interest rate
No,
risk.
ma'am. I've read it. Here it is, bigger than Dallas.
Well, to the extent that there are assets held in an available for sale portfolio that would suffer losses due to changing interest rates, that would be captured in the bank's
No, ma'am, it's not
capital.
there. I've read it.
Senator Kennedy, I've allowed people the Secretary to stray over answers.
And this was the moment. When Senator John Kennedy looked directly at Janet Yellen, the sitting Treasury Secretary of the United States, and asked the most uncomfortably simple question in all of fiscal governance. So you haven't reduced the deficit, have you? No metaphor, no academic buffer, no ideological filter. Just the direct collision between real debt math and the political language Washington uses to describe that math. Because what happened here, live, on camera, is one of the most important, repeatable, archetypal breakdowns of the last decade of American fiscal discourse. When Kennedy said the proposed budget was roughly $500 billion more in spending than the current year, Yellen did not dispute it. When he pointed out that federal spending is up more than 50% since 2019 while population is up less than 2%, she could not deny it. When he stated that gross national debt would move from $33 trillion to over $51 trillion within a decade under the president's own budget proposal, she did not say no, only that it would have been worse under a baseline. This is the Washington tell. This is the great linguistic sleight of hand. Deficit reduction here is not measured by the direction of debt, but direction relative to a hypothetical you never see, a hypothetical where debt explodes even faster. This is the kind of moral and mathematical drift that only survives inside the walls of Washington. And Kennedy called it out, not with rage, but with the dry incredulity of a man trying to pull the country back into the world of arithmetic. Because the word improvement in this room did not mean debt falling. It meant debt rising slower than an imaginary scenario. The reason this moment matters is because it forces America to stare directly at the single greatest bipartisan structural crisis of our time. We have built a political economy incapable of telling the truth about the cost of government. We have built a political vocabulary that can describe debt that rises by trillions as fiscal responsibility, as long as it could have risen by even more trillions. And the country outside this room, the voters, the workers, the families who do not write these budgets, who cannot shift baseline assumptions, who cannot add $4.7 trillion in new taxes to offset costs. They do not get to live inside hypotheticals. They live inside bank accounts. They live inside grocery bills. They live inside interest rates. They live inside the bond market. They live inside the real cost of government debt. Because one day, the debt is not conceptual anymore. One day, the debt is interest. One day, the debt is taxes. One day, the debt is inflation pressure. One day, the debt is scarcity. One day, the debt is national strategic vulnerability. One day, the debt is a mathematical wall that reality refuses to negotiate. And in this hearing, that wall walked into view. When Yellen said she didn't have access to whether the Federal Reserve had warned Silicon Valley Bank in 2019, when it is the most consequential bank failure in the modern era, it was another symptom of the same thing. A compartmentalized government with compartmentalized accountability that becomes structurally incapable of owning the system it actually presides over. She wasn't claiming malevolence. She wasn't claiming defiance. She was stating the quiet truth of modern federal complexity. Every crisis has 10 owners and 0 owners simultaneously. Kennedy was not playing for soundbite. He was playing for clarity. He was forcing the Treasury Secretary to say out loud, on record, that Washington is redefining the word improvement in ways that normal Americans would never accept in their personal finances. Because if you go from $33,000 of personal debt to $51,000, you are not improving your financial health. You are accelerating your financial collapse. This is not partisan. This is structural. This is moral. Democracy cannot function if language becomes untethered from lived experience, because the moment government can redefine debt upward as progress, there is no natural limiting principle left. There is no feedback loop. There is no grounding mechanism. There is no line that forces the governing class to make trade-offs with the same gravity that every citizen must make with their own money. This hearing was a warning flare, a reminder that fiscal truth still exists, a reminder that someone in this room still remembers the difference between arithmetic and narrative. If the American system wants to survive this century, not in theory, not in slogans, but in reality, then this moment has to be understood not as theater, but as diagnosis. There is no democracy in the world that has ever been able to outrun math. There is no civilization in history that survived by redefining unsustainable trajectory as sustainable. This is not a fight about left or right. This is a fight about whether we still live in a country where the word fact has meaning. So tonight, as this hearing fades, remember what you saw. Remember how simple the question was. Remember how cinematic it felt. Remember how rare candor in that room has become. Truth is not partisan. Truth is structural. Truth is the oxygen democracy breathes. Subscribe to the Congress Brief. Stay here. Stay awake.